Howdy, y'all. This is Bill McCamley, and welcome to What the Bleep Does This Mean? It's a podcast where we try to describe a fairly complicated public topic in language you can hopefully understand in 15 minutes or less. And today's topic is this: why the hell is housing so expensive? Poll after poll after poll in the 2024 election told us something very clearly. People are seriously worried about the cost of things right now. In 2022, inflation, which tells us how much the price of things we buy is going up, was 9%, which is the highest in 40 years. And even though the Republicans are currently in their honeymoon period after a presidential election, when Americans generally back who was elected, a recent poll shows 66% of Americans think that Republicans in Washington aren't doing enough to keep prices affordable. And when we normally think of these prices when it comes to things, it's groceries. Everyone knows about the cost of eggs right now, or gas. But there's another really important issue for many of us, and that's the price of putting a roof over your head. A poll last year showed that 74% of all of us across the political spectrum think a lack of affordable housing is a major problem. 44% of renters reported that their rents went up in the last year, and even 26% of homeowners saw an increase in how much they're paying every month for their mortgages. So, why is this a problem? Well, being able to sleep indoors is super important. And if you have to put more of your paycheck into your rent or your mortgage, that's less you've got for food or gas or health insurance or savings or even a movie or concert once in a while. And in fact, there's a term experts actually use for this problem. It's called cost burdened. This means if you pay more than 30% of your monthly take home pay on housing, you are burdened. Turns out about a third of us in the States are in this category, with about half of renters being burdened. This is a real problem for two age groups in America. The first is seniors, with a real issue being older folks who rent. Many are living on fixed incomes, meaning they get the same amount of money every month from like their pensions or Social Security. But if their rent goes up and their monthly income doesn't, remember it's fixed, the less you have for everything else. And over 11 million Americans over the age of 65 are cost burdened. And if you need long-term services like help getting around, most people simply can't afford both. The other group is young people. Over 30% of Gen Z adults, folks born after 1996, and yes, that is the year I graduated from high school, reported living with their parents because they couldn't afford to get their own place. Among other things, video games, social media, etc., it can be a huge problem when trying to date. And even if you have a place, stories abound about how a lack of financial security, including your own place, has proved a huge barrier to long-term and stable relationships. So why is the rent too damn high? Well, there's a few issues, but the main one is simple: supply and demand. There simply aren't as many houses and apartments around at the level people can afford them. This makes prices rise. It's like when bird flu limits the supply of eggs, but the same amount of people, like me, want their omelets in the morning, prices go up. There's some big reasons for this issue. The first is actually retirees. It used to be pretty common for a family to have kind of a housing formula, right? You get hitched, you buy a starter home, which is generally fairly small. Then you pay the mortgage for a couple of years, and when you're making a bit more and you have a kid or two, you sell that smaller home and you buy a bigger place. And then, and here is the important part, when your kids moved out, you sell that bigger house and you get a smaller place, leaving the bigger one open for another family that could move in and use the space. But in the past few years, retirees have stopped selling their homes. Some of the reasons are financial. They don't want new debt. They're worried about the price of higher interest rates. Maybe their kids have moved back in, or emotional. They're proud of their home and they know all the services around a neighborhood they've lived in forever. This has decreased the amount of houses available for people with kids that are currently in their quote unquote starter home, so they stay in it, which then leaves less supply for people looking to get their first place. Another huge roadblock is a thing called single family zoning. Now, what the hell does this even mean? I spent 4 years as a county commissioner, so can actually tell you. See, local governments, like cities and counties, have the power to create zones over certain pieces of land, which determine how many homes can be built on them. So if a piece of land is zoned for only a single family home with big yards, rather than allowing for townhomes or fourplexes or apartments and condos, that means less overall homes can be built on that same piece of land. which leads to lack of supply. And there's a really terrible reason for a lot of these zoning laws, and it's straight up racism. See, in 1917, the US Supreme Court made it illegal for zoning to be done purely based on race. So, what did cities do? They started making up shit like minimum lot sizes, how big a housing lot had to be, or setback requirements, which is how far back a house has to be from the street. And that kept things more expensive. And Black folks, who generally couldn't afford the bigger places, they were kept out of the traditional white neighborhoods. And those type of attitudes continue to exist today. In my old job in Austin, I worked to help change the zoning laws. And in one of the public forums, when people advocated for a change in zoning, because a lot of these workers, like nurses and teachers, couldn't afford to live near the city where their jobs were, one of the opponents was quoted as saying, "Those people can live in Kyle," which is a town about 40 minutes away from downtown during rush hour. But less zoning, and therefore allowing for smaller homes that can be built closer together, means, ta-da, more homes and therefore less cost. Take Houston. Houston is famous in nerdy planning circles, of which, yes, I have proudly been a part, for not having any zoning. This is not without its issues. Some people might have problems with, for instance, churches next to strip clubs or houses next to roller coasters, which exist. But the average price of a new home in Houston, where there are way more townhomes and condos and single family homes with smaller yards, is a whopping 23% less than in Austin, which until recently had some of the most stringent restrictions on building new homes in the country. Luckily, arguments like that one the one lady had who didn't like those people, they didn't win. But this is a cycle that hits renters too. If folks can't afford to buy a house, then more stay in their current rental places, again, decreasing supply. And more renters, along with less apartments, which can't be built in single family zones, means higher prices. Again, Houston and Austin. The average rent in Austin is about $1,700 a month. In Houston, it's about $400 cheaper at $1,300 a month. Another reason for high prices, the cost of construction, which generally falls into two categories: supplies and labor. For supplies, think lumber or metal or drywall, the stuff you need to build a house or apartment complex with. Prices went way up during COVID as people decided to use that time to improve their homes. But prices actually started going up in 2017 when trade disputes happened around the world. That's when Republicans started their first tariffs on Chinese imports. Well, when prices increase on the stuff you need to build these homes and apartments, the cost gets passed on to the renter or the buyer. And while costs have settled a bit over the past year, they are still way above where they were before tariffs and COVID. For the labor issue, let's face it, construction work is super hard. It's intense. You got to go out in all sorts of weather, including the summer heat, and it requires specialized training. It takes time to learn how to do things like plumbing or carpentry or roofing the right way. And training programs, even with all the efforts from community colleges and union apprenticeship programs, it's still not giving the US enough of these workers. And right now, there aren't enough skilled laborers to fill demand, so those workers can demand higher pay, raising costs. The last thing I'll mention, and this is just in relation to buying a house, is junk fees. When you apply to get a loan to buy a house, which most of us need, the cost of borrowing has increased since the Great Recession of 2008 to 2010. Think things like application fees, credit checks, administrative fees, all the stuff in the little print on your document. In fact, just between 2021 and 22, so a couple of years ago, the cost to borrow money for a house went up 21% to average about $6,000. And that is shitty for low income folks because those are fixed fees. You pay the same $6,000 extra if you're borrowing $300,000 or $3 million. So what can we do all about this stuff? Probably the most effective thing is the zoning issue, since it has such a huge effect on the price of housing and it's done at the local level. Getting involved at your city or your county council when there is a proposed change works pretty well. And if you want to do this, you're probably going to have to be aware of a couple of terms: NIMBY and YIMBY. NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. It's a term used to describe people who say something like, well, we certainly need more of X, so we need more houses or trains or shelters for unhoused people or whatever, but I don't want it near me. It's something that occurs in pretty much every community in the country. YIMBY, on the other hand, stands for Yes in My Backyard. And there are groups around the country leading the way in educating and advocating for changes in rules that allow more housing to be developed near you. A great example of this, as I said earlier, is Austin. YIMBY groups have been working there for years to elect people to the city council that agree with more housing, and then working them once they're elected to make real changes that will bring the cost of housing down. And last year, they passed some of the most serious reforms to housing rules in the nation after days, literally, of debate. If you want to get involved, there's groups across the nation and probably one in your community. Just do a quick internet search for YIMBY, YMBY, plus your community, and the chances are you'll find and then be able to work with them to figure out what's going on, and they probably need your help. There are also some efforts at the state level to get more housing built. So California just passed a pretty comprehensive package this last year that focuses on holding local governments accountable for rules that restrict new housing. And Texas is actually looking at something very similar this year. And the cool thing about these packages, they aren't traditional Republican versus Democrat things. You have a fairly interesting coalition of people like young liberal urban activists and older libertarians who just don't like government that both want the same thing here. So it's one of the ways to do something that can bring people together in today's divisive political world. However, there are some things going on at the national level that threaten housing that you can afford, and it is unfortunately very partisan. The first thing is a national Republican effort to deport a ton of people. Remember how we were just talking about the lack of workers in the construction industry and how that increased costs? Well, a study at the University of Michigan Civil Engineering Department showed that about 1.6 million people in the construction industry live here illegally. That's about 20% of everybody in the country building stuff. And in some states, it's way higher. In Texas, it's about 60% of workers in the construction industry that are undocumented. So if there's a huge effort to deport all of these folks, then guess what happens? A recent study by the University of Utah found that when counties implement higher regulations for undocumented folks in construction, for every 4 years they do it, they lose 1 year of possible housing construction. Again, less supply means less houses, which equals higher prices for you and me. Another national issue that will increase the cost of your rent or mortgage, tariffs. National Republicans have been pushing for more of these, which are fees that people outside the US pay to the government when they ship something here. And the cost of people buying that stuff gets raised to pay for it. The president wants to use these and cuts to a bunch of federal agencies like the National NOAA, which gives us our weather, or the Labor Department, or whatever, to get rid of the US income tax. The problem is tariffs are basically a sales tax for everything you buy, cars, food, and yes, housing. Remember, Republican tariffs increased the cost of housing materials in 2017, and now they're being considered again this year. It has people in the industry worried. The National Home Builders Council estimated that about 7% of everything used to build a house, which is around $13 billion, is imported from another country. Think metal products from China, gypsum or lime from Mexico, or wood from Canada. New tariffs would raise prices on this stuff $3 to $4 billion. And again, when prices for these things go up, what happens then? Rents and mortgages go up. The last thing that will raise prices is the Republican dismantling of a thing called the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau. This is a federal agency set up after the 2008 financial crisis to protect people from things like those junk fees we talked about earlier. Since 2011, when it started, they've helped settle about 8 million complaints and helped over $20 billion get back to regular Americans who had been billed for illegal stuff. Unfortunately, Elon Musk has said the agency has to go, and he is basically the president right now, has put all of the employees of the agency on leave and is looking to fire them all. It's still being decided by the courts as of when this is being considered, but removing these folks will increase prices. So if you're worried about home and rental prices, call your US senator and rep and tell them how it feels when more tariffs, deportations, and getting rid of people making sure you're not being charged illegally makes your rent or mortgage crazier. I'm guessing not good. Thanks for everyone for listening to this. Would really appreciate your feedback. You can comment on any of the social media sites you find this on, or you can email me at whatthebleepdoesthismean@gmail.com. Again, thanks a lot and good luck everybody out there.